The Victorian mansion loomed before me, its dilapidated facade a grotesque mockery of its former grandeur. Peeling paint clung desperately to rotting wood, and shattered windows gaped like toothless maws in the fading twilight. As I approached, the weight of my camera equipment seemed to increase with each step, my journalistic instincts warring with a primal urge to flee. I am Sarah Blackwood, and I've spent the last 5 years chasing stories that others were too afraid to touch, but nothing could have prepared me for the horrors that awaited within those crumbling walls. The door creaked open at my touch, the sound echoing through empty halls like a death rattle. The stench hit me first, a nauseating mixture of decay, chemicals, and something I couldn't quite place. Something wrong. I swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in my throat, and stepped inside. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and floors stained with substances I didn't want to identify. As I moved deeper into the house, the air grew thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional scurrying of unseen creatures in the walls. A sudden crash from above made me jump, my heart pounding against my ribs. I turned, ready to bolt, when a scream pierced the air, a sound of such raw agony that it froze me in place. My mind raced. This was it, the proof I needed. The missing persons I'd been tracking. They were here. I crept up the creaking stairs, each step an agonizing eternity. The screams grew louder, more desperate. I reached the second floor, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls as my hand shook. A door at the end of the hall stood ajar, spilling sickly yellow light into the corridor. As I approached, the screams abruptly cut off, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound that made my skin crawl. I peered through the crack in the door and immediately wished I hadn't. The room beyond was a nightmare made real. Operating tables lined the walls, each bearing a figure so mutilated and twisted that they barely resembled humans anymore. And there, in the center of it all, stood a woman in a blood-spattered lab coat, her back to me as she hunched over her latest victim, Dr. Evelyn Blackwood, my aunt. The woman I'd idolized as a child, whose brilliance in genetics had inspired my own passion for uncovering the truth. And now, the monster responsible for these atrocities. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, because suddenly she turned. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw no recognition in her gaze, only a cold, clinical interest that chilled me to my core. "Ah, Sarah," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I've been expecting you." Before I could react, strong hands grabbed me from behind. I struggled, but it was useless. As a cloth pressed against my face, the world began to spin. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Aunt Evelyn's smile, a twisted parody of the warm expression I remembered from my childhood. I awoke strapped to a cold metal table, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights searing my retinas. Aunt Evelyn loomed over me, her once kind features now a mask of madness. "My dear niece," she cooed, running a gloved hand along my cheek. "You always were too curious for your own good. But don't worry, you'll be my greatest creation yet." What followed was agony beyond description. I felt every incision, every injection, every moment as my body was torn apart and reshaped. Black feathers erupted from my skin, each one feeling like a knife being driven into my flesh. My bones cracked and reformed, my jaw elongating into a razor-sharp beak. Through it all, Aunt Evelyn's voice droned on, explaining her twisted vision. How she'd discovered the key to human-animal hybridization, how she would revolutionize evolution itself. Her words blurred together, lost in the haze of my pain and the growing chorus of inhuman voices in my head. Days, maybe weeks passed. My transformation continued, each change bringing new horrors. My eyes burned as they reshaped, the world taking on a sickening red tint. When I finally saw my reflection in a shattered mirror, I barely recognized myself. A creature gazed back at me, part woman, part raven, with glowing crimson eyes and teeth that could tear flesh from bone. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the psychological torment. I felt my human mind slipping away, replaced by primal instincts and a hunger I couldn't control. The voices of the other experiments grew louder, a cacophony of pain and rage that threatened to drive me mad. One night, as I huddled in my cage, I heard a commotion outside. The power flickered, then died. In the darkness, I heard the sound of locks disengaging. Freedom. I burst from my prison, my new form allowing me to navigate the pitch-black corridors with ease. All around me, other experiments were escaping, twisted amalgamations of human and animal, their cries a symphony of suffering. As I fled through the mansion, I encountered horrors that would haunt me forever. A man fused with a snake, his lower body a writhing mass of scales as he strangled one of Aunt Evelyn's assistants. A woman whose skin had been replaced with fish scales, gasping for air as she flopped helplessly on the floor. And worst of all, a child, no more than 10 years old, whose body was slowly calcifying into coral, silent tears streaming down his face as he reached out with a petrifying hand. I wanted to help them, but the raven part of me screamed to survive, to flee. I was torn between my human compassion and my new predatory nature. Suddenly, I found myself face to face with one of Aunt Evelyn's assistants, a burly man with dead eyes and a wicked-looking scalpel. Without thinking, I lunged. My beak tore into his throat, blood spraying across my feathers. I should have been horrified, but instead, I felt a sick thrill of satisfaction. As I made my way through the labyrinthine halls, I pieced together the fragments of overheard conversations and stolen glances at research notes. Aunt Evelyn's descent into madness hadn't been sudden. It had started years ago, with the death of her son, my cousin, to a rare genetic disorder. Her grief had twisted into an obsession with fixing the human genome, no matter the cost. I found her in her private lab, surrounded by bubbling vats of chemicals and whirring centrifuges. When she saw me, her eyes lit up with a mixture of pride and mania. "Sarah, my beautiful creation," she breathed. "Look at what you've become. Together, we'll change the world." I wanted to scream, to tell her she was insane, but all that came out was a guttural caw. She approached me, arms outstretched, and something inside me snapped. I lunged, my talons raking across her face. She stumbled back, shock turning to rage as she grabbed a nearby syringe. We clashed in a frenzy of feathers and blood. I felt the needle pierce my skin, injecting me with God knows what, but I didn't care. My beak found her jugular, and I tore. The fight was brutal, primal. I felt bones crack beneath my talons, heard the wet tearing of flesh, and through it all, a part of me reveled in the violence. When it was over, I stood over Aunt Evelyn's broken body, panting. Her blood dripped from my beak, and I realized with horror that I wanted to taste it. As sirens wailed in the distance, I made my way to the mansion's roof. The cool night air ruffled my feathers as I perched on the edge, surveying the world below. I should have felt relief, knowing that the nightmare was over. Instead, I felt only a growing hunger for justice, for vengeance, for blood. I spread my wings, feeling the power in my new form. The society that had turned a blind eye to the disappearances, that had allowed monsters like Aunt Evelyn to operate in the shadows, they would pay, and I would be the instrument of their reckoning. As I launched myself into the night sky, a chilling realization settled over me. The true horror wasn't what had been done to me. It was what I had become, and what I was capable of doing to others. The last human part of me wept as I soared away from the mansion, leaving behind the remnants of my old life. But the raven, the creature I now was, cawed in triumph. The hunt was just beginning.